Hi, everyone. I have the privilege today of introducing Sue Swenson, and I'm going to read you the bio that I was giving with a little bit of edits. Sue Swenson is the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, OSERS. The Office of OSERS is the umbrella, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, for OSEP, which is our funding agent. In this capacity, she serves as the advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Education, Dr. King, on matters related to the education of children and youth with disabilities, as well as employment, community living for youth and adults with disabilities. The mission of her office is to provide leadership to achieve full integration and participation in society of people with disabilities by ensuring equal opportunity and access to and excellence in education, employment, and community living. Now, I was looking at this, Sue, and I noticed it says, in addition to serving as Acting Assistant Secretary, Sue will continue to be Deputy Assistant Secretary for OSERS. So I'm wondering if that means you work for yourself.
I do.
Okay.
I'm a terrible boss.
She's held this position for the last 6 years. Before this, Sue was served in the Clinton administration as the Commissioner for Developmental Disabilities in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And before that, she was the Executive Director of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation and CEO of the ARC in the United States. I think that's around the time I met you.
Yes.
And that was probably when you moved from Minnesota to Maryland. This is the important part. Sue got involved with disability advocacy because of her middle son, Charlie, who had profound disabilities. She was active in the Minneapolis schools as well as state and federal policy while working as a professional services marketing director before being named a Kennedy Fellow in the U.S. Senate in 1996. She's done a lot of stuff. She's big.
I need to make a short bio.
Yeah, well, I really do like
thank
this.
you.
But the other thing is Sue reads everything, and I am just absolutely amazed at the wealth of your knowledge, and I'm so glad you're
kind.
here.
Thank you for everything. So I'm probably going to walk around because I can't help doing it. You'll notice I'm carrying my phone. That's because it has my timer on it. Somebody gave me 5 minutes. So I'm starting 5 minutes earlier than I thought, so I'm going to use it. So I just want to start by thanking you for, sorry?
You can talk as long as you want.
Okay. Don't ever say that to me. Some of you have heard me speak. I can go on and on. I'm not using PowerPoints because in my hands they are powerless, pointless. I know that many of you have developed the arts of using these tools and technologies to help get points across, help people see data together. These are all really important things to do, not in my hands. I'm incapable. So I want to start by telling you something about Washington, D.C. How many of you have been to the Jefferson Memorial? And you realize how close you are to Monticello when you're sitting here in Crystal City. Now, something that people don't know about Jefferson, and I know if you like Hamilton, people think you can't like Jefferson at the same time. I think you can like both, and I'll explain why in a minute. But Jefferson had a sister, Elizabeth, who was 2 years younger than he. He grew up with Elizabeth. They lived together their whole lives. You know how brilliant Jefferson was. John Kennedy once had a dinner for Nobel Prize winners in the White House, and he said, "This is perhaps the greatest collection of intellect ever to be assembled in the White House, except when Mr. Jefferson dined alone." Jefferson was a brilliant man. His sister Elizabeth was classified in the language of the time as being an imbecile. What that meant in those days was she had probably 5 or 6 words, and she had a lot of other disabilities. She could walk, she could talk, but a little bit. When his mother died, he wrote a letter to the other people who were involved in the Continental Congress and said, "I'm sorry, I now have to step back from this political work because I am responsible for my sister Elizabeth, and she lives with us at Monticello, and I can't do both. And he chose her over the work that he was doing with the Continental Congress. Now, in 1774, there was a hurricane following an earthquake at Monticello. And you know people with anxiety, right? Elizabeth ran from the house, was followed by her maid, and they found their bodies 2 weeks later drowned in the river. At which point Jefferson wrote to the Continental Congress and said, "Sadly, I am now free to re-engage in the work that we are doing together to form this nation." So what I think, having found this recently, noodling around on the Monticello website, what I think is that when Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," he was not only thinking about himself and his partners in the Continental Congress, he was thinking about his sister Elizabeth. And I hope somewhere in the back of his mind, he was also thinking about people of other races with whom he had very awful and uncomfortable relationships. I hope he was planting an acorn that he knew someday was going to grow into a tree that other people would eat the fruit of and sit under in the shade. I hope that that was true, but I believe that he was at least thinking about Elizabeth. So we think of Jefferson also as the founder of public education in the United States, the main proponent of the idea that if we're going to have a democracy, every citizen has a right and a responsibility to be educated. I think it's really interesting that he had this relationship with his sister. In the 18th century, in the United States, even before we were the United States, we had institutions for people with disabilities. Elizabeth could easily have been sent away, and she wasn't. Patrick Henry had a wife with probably what we would now call Alzheimer's disease, because she went into a very steep decline very late in her life, where she was basically lost all of her abilities to think and process what was going on in her life. He kept her at home too. He didn't send her to an institution. So this notion of inclusion is built into our nation. And we have gotten away from it at various times. We have developed notions that science tells us that people need to be separated. When there were institutions in the 18th century in the US, it was just the beginning of thinking that science could be applied to human development and that certain people would need to be removed from the population. Sometimes people say, oh, it was for their protection, but it developed into a eugenics movement that said, no, we need to get rid of those people because we don't want to have them in our gene pool. Oh, and by the way, Jefferson didn't say all people are created equal. He said all men are created equal, but I didn't think that was going to go over big in this crowd. When we think about what we are doing in American schools and how we move it forward, believe me, those of us in the federal government are constantly looking for evidence and best practice. And I have to wear that hat every day. Where's the evidence for what we're talking about? When we put out any kind of policy, where's the evidence? How do we build on this? But you guys, I do that with my mother's heart just beating inside. Now, I lost my son Charlie at age 30, but he was included throughout school. Charlie never walked or talked. Charlie was included in second grade when I asked the teacher who had had his older brother, Will, could Charlie please come into your class for 5 minutes of inclusion after lunch when you do story time? And the wonderful teacher said, sure, that's okay, he can come in. And 2 weeks later, she called me at work and said, Sue, I have a problem and I'm going to need permission from you. And I thought, oh God, she can't handle them for 5 minutes. But she said, Sue, would it be okay with you if Charlie stayed with us all afternoon? Because the other kids don't want him to go back to that little room. They think it's sad. And I said, Joan, as a special favor to you, he can stay with you all afternoon. But see, that's organic inclusion. It's not me going in and saying, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to make your life a living hell. And sometimes I think that's what's expected from parent advocates, is this notion that I have more rights than you have and I can force my child on you. And I think we need to do much more to support the natural and organic inclusion of children with disabilities in American schools, because other children really do rise. Charlie never had a teacher who didn't tell me it was their best year in teaching. And you know why? It's because when there's a kid with profound disabilities in the classroom, the other children organize their caring. They begin to think of each other in more humane ways. I really think that's what Charlie did for the classroom. And in some ways, I don't mean this disrespectfully, I loved my son and thought he was a genius. But he held down the bottom of the class. So no matter who struggled to read, or who stuttered when they read, or who had trouble with mathematics, they could always help Charlie. And we know that that notion of children helping each other really does scaffold what they learn. It really helps them move forward. At first, when the teachers presented that idea to me, it was about my son Will. They wanted him to tutor other children in the school, and I was like, no, he doesn't work for you. I mean, okay, I was born 40 years old. My kindergarten class thought I worked for the teacher, right? I'm sure many of you had that same kind of bossy background. But I didn't want him to be doing that. And then I stood back because she convinced me and watched how the interaction that Will had with kids who were struggling really deepened his understanding of what he was talking about and really helped him see the richness in the material instead of just skating along on the top and passing the test. That's what I saw with Charlie's inclusion over and over again. I saw a theater teacher, and when Charlie was in 9th grade, I registered for a theater class because he loved opera, and I wanted him to learn how to participate in an audience. That is not an unimportant skill to have in this world. So he's in the theater class, and the theater teacher calls me and says, we got to have an IEP because Charlie just is making noise all the time. And I don't know if I can figure out how to do this. This was 9th grade. And I said, well, he's making noise because he's bored, because that's what he does. When he gets bored, he makes noise. And the teacher went, huh. And he called me up again in a couple of weeks and said, you know what? They were all bored. But again, how do children with disabilities enrich a classroom, right? That school now wins awards for its theater program. I don't want to say it was because of Charlie, but this guy figured out, if I put Charlie on the stage, the other kids remember their lines. Is there any explanation for that? No. Is there any evidence base for that? No. Is it observable? Yes. That's a key point. Because some of the kids with disabilities that we are talking about in inclusive settings are like my Charlie. He was identified by his physician as being about a 1 in 5 million level of disability. Do you think there's a randomized control trial that describes how he can be educated? Right? Now, you know and I know that there are people who think inclusion is some kind of plot. Right? There are people who think vaccinations are some kind of plot and tests are some kind of plot. There are people who think the moon landing was made up. Did you guys notice 2 days ago was the 47th anniversary of the moon landing? And Buzz Aldrin is being accused, he's being sued for all of the money that he's earned as an astronaut after he landed on the moon by a guy who says, "You faked it, it was fake, I want all the money." And this guy was following Buzz Aldrin around with his conspiracy theories. And Buzz Aldrin punched him in the nose. Now, I'm a girl and I'm a pacifist, so I can't punch people in the nose, and I don't believe in punching people in the nose, but dang, I really liked seeing that on TV. We do need to think about the reality, the human reality of children. The responsibility that you have is to respond in schools every day to the human reality of that child at that moment in his or her life. Sometimes you do not have time to do a literature search, to figure out what is the response. What Swift is doing is giving you tools so that you have a better way of responding in a multi-tiered way. What are the needs of each child? How do we respond? How do we look them in the eyes and respond? You know, if I ask a room full of people, "Are you responsible for this?" People will say, "Oh, no, not me." But if you ask a room full of people, "Are you a responsible person?" Everyone says, "Well, of course, yes, I'm a responsible person." And classically in philosophy, responsibility has 4 parts. The first is accountability for consequences. So not only the consequences of doing something, but the consequences of doing nothing. Right? And you have to have accountability systems that reach that level. The second piece is rationality. You can't be held responsible if you don't know or understand. So we have let teachers, many teachers, Charlie's teachers were all wonderful. I don't know if I was just lucky or if teachers are more wonderful than sometimes we give them credit for. I suspect that's true. But some teachers have gotten through their whole life saying, "Well, I don't know what to do with a kid with a disability, so I'm off the hook." But you're not off the hook, because you're still looking that kid in the eye and you're still making choices that will set the course for that child's life. And we need to give people tools so that they have the rationality to be able to respond, to be able to be responsible. And it's our job to make sure that they have those tools. And the third part of responsibility is freedom. You can't hold someone responsible if they don't have the freedom to respond. Right? This is why in legal circles you always hear about someone being under duress. You know, if you're forced to not do something, then you can't be held responsible for it. I worry about this with our law, with IDEA. I worry every day that we have made it so complex and so difficult to understand that people really don't feel that they have the freedom. The principals feel, "Oh God, I'm not sure if I'm doing something wrong, I better not do anything." And the thing I like about Swift is you're bringing information to these levels of decision makers to help them understand, no, here are your freedoms. Here is the way that you are allowed to respond. The most important piece of responsibility is duty, a sense of duty. It's an understanding of what am I supposed to do that you carry around in your heart, that's your sense. What is your duty to yourself? That's, I think, where all of this energy in the room comes from, is you guys beginning to feel free, to have a sense of, we're better together. My duty is to connect to other people. My duty is to think about this child in front of me and also all of the other children in the school. You know, as soon as I started working on inclusion for Charlie in school, Will, who was 2 years older, said, "Hey, Mom, when are you going to work on inclusion for gifted kids?" Because he was mad that he was being taken out of class. And kids would bully him terribly. I mean, it wasn't much use because he was like this giant kid. But there's a lot of bullying that goes on, making fun of kids who are good at math or who are gifted too. So, gifted, whatever that means. Every child is gifted. So, that's, I think, what's driving here, and I hope that you will have chances in the time remaining to explore what your duty really is as teachers, as administrators, as parts of the SWIFT system. Something else I want to talk to you about is sustainability, and I wish, you know, in England, the bureaucracy used to tell everyone in India, "We are your mother and your father." And I wish that my little office could fund not only this, but 10 times this. Unlikely? Not impossible? Well, impossible. So how do you now take what you've learned and carry it forward into the future without being dependent on federal funding? Think about that. I'm not saying you need to be independent of federal funding. I'm saying you should consider how would you build it if you wanted it to be self-sustaining. 3 parts of sustainability. 1, a system that is sustainable has to be flexible. So it has to be able to change with more or less resource, more or less attention, more or less connection. It has to be something that will find a way to move forward, even in whatever circumstances. So if American schools, for some reason, if the funding gets worse, you would be able to sustain. If it got better, you would be able to sustain. I worry sometimes that we bring our best ideas to schools that are struggling because they have poor funding, and we leave the really rich schools with our worst ideas. Right? How would you make this sustainable if you were going to try to reach schools in all circumstances? Flexibility. Second, diversity, and by that I do not mean racial diversity, although that's part of it. But a diverse system is one that meets the needs of everyone involved. Now, I think SWIFT is closer to that than almost any other grantees program that I've seen, because you're trying to meet the needs of the principal and the families and the teachers and everyone involved in the school community. And that's really important. There are other needs around that. There are the state policymakers. They have needs also. There are feds. We have needs. We have needs for data and evidence, and you're serving those needs. But if you want to be sustainable, you have to think about that. Whose need is not being met? And how could we help move that forward? I think I'm the only parent advocate I know who ever carried a sign at a state legislature on Developmental Disabilities Day that said, "I demand better data." You guys know anybody in the parent movement who's done that except me? I told you I was weird. But that needs to be part of sustainability. And the last piece of sustainability is responsivity. A sustainable system has to be able to respond to feedback. And I do not mean you're going to send a survey out and ask people, was this okay? Did you give us a smiley face or a 5 on a scale of 5. What I mean is it's built into the system. So when you see that people want more of something, you can give them more. And when you see they want less of something, you can give them less. And you have to build that into the management system. That is a kind of evidence that we don't talk about much. So American business runs on that evidence. It runs on evidence that's generated at a management level, not evidence that's published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I'm not suggesting that we replace what happens in schools with the kinds of things that run American businesses, but we should be considering how to learn from some of their best tools. And really, that's what you're doing in Swift, is measuring, how did this work? How did this work? How are these kids doing? How are those kids doing? And you're putting that in front of decision makers. It's not going into a peer-reviewed journal before it comes back to the principal in the school. I have a favorite picture, and I really do in my heart appreciate evidence, and I don't mean to sound like I don't appreciate it, but I have this great picture of somebody carrying a sign at a state legislature, and it says, "What do we want? Evidence-based practice. When do we want it? After peer review." Because guys, that child is 5 years old and is going to learn to read in the next 3 years or not, and doesn't have time to wait while you design your study and try to figure out how to randomize the sample and try to figure out how to design the control of who's in or who's out. That child doesn't have a chance for you to do that. And if that child, like my child, is an outlier, you're not going to be doing that anyway, because you can't. The thing with people with profound disabilities is they are profoundly individual. And how are you going to figure out how to respond to their needs? So I want to read something, and I'll be very quick. This is from Jefferson, from the memorial. If you go to the memorial, if you have been there, you saw it on the wall. It says, "I'm certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and constitutions. Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when he was a boy, as ask civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors." Mr. Jefferson said that in a letter in 1816, 40 years after he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." 40 years, and he was already calling himself a barbarous ancestor. The IDEA celebrated its 40th anniversary last year. It's time for people with your wisdom and your knowledge and your understanding of how this works in schools to be thinking about how are you going to inform Congress about what needs to change, what needs to happen, how can it be better, how would it work better, given the evidence, given the progress of the human mind that we have seen in these 40 years, how can we make it better? And I hope some of you will be empowered not just to work in your schools. I think that is probably the most honorable thing you could possibly do, is work in schools with children and principals and teachers and everyone together. But I hope some of you will find a moment to think about how do we work together to make this law better for kids and families and teachers and principals and everyone else. Thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you're doing.